In a secluded corner of the affluent neighborhood of Oakwood Hills lived John, a humble and dedicated black gardener. John had worked for the Thompson family for over a decade, meticulously tending to every plant and flower in the mansion's vast garden. Despite his hard work, the Thompson family never truly appreciated his dedication. Mrs. Thompson, a woman of high status and stern demeanor, treated him with cold indifference, while her brother, Mark, never missed an opportunity to make John's life miserable with derogatory and humiliating comments. Mrs. Thompson, an heir to a vast fortune, had always lived in a bubble of luxury. Her brother Mark, on the other hand, was a dark shadow over the family, addicted to drugs and gambling. His presence only brought problems and shame. However, despite his vices, he was always protected by Mrs. Thompson, who covered up his misdeeds and kept him away from the law. John, with his kind nature and hard-working spirit, silently endured the constant insults and disdain. His only motivation was to provide for his family, his wife Maria and their two young children, Lucy and Johnny. Each day after long hours of work, he would return to his modest home on the outskirts of the neighborhood, finding solace in the love of his family. The financial crisis soon hit the economy of the region. The Thompsons, accustomed to abundance, suddenly found themselves in a precarious situation. Mr. Thompson's investments plummeted, and debts began to pile up. Desperate to maintain appearances, Mrs. Thompson started selling her jewelry and valuables. One morning, chaos erupted in the mansion when Mrs. Thompson's most precious jewels disappeared. Mark, trembling and nervous, seized the opportunity to blame John. "It was the gardener," he shouted with feigned indignation. Mrs. Thompson, blinded by fear of losing everything, decided to accuse John without proof. John was fired and thrown out of the mansion with unfounded accusations of theft. The public humiliation was devastating. As he left the property with his tools in hand, he vowed in his heart that one day he would prove his innocence and reclaim his dignity. The days following John's expulsion were a whirlwind of chaos and desperation for the Thompson family. Without the jewels and with mounting debts, Mrs. Thompson and her husband were forced to sell the mansion. The news of their downfall spread quickly, and soon those who once admired and respected them began to avoid them. Mrs. Thompson, proud and arrogant, now had to face the reality of their new situation. Mark, meanwhile, continued his life of excess without remorse for falsely accusing John. The loss of the family fortune didn't matter to him as long as he could continue with his vices. John, on the other hand, struggled to find another job. His reputation had been tarnished by the theft accusations, and no one wanted to hire a gardener accused of being a thief. Nights in his humble home were filled with worry and sadness. Maria, his constant support, comforted him and reminded him that the truth would eventually come to light. One afternoon, while walking through the market in search of temporary work, John heard rumors about a gold rush in a distant region. Tired of the humiliations and determined to change his destiny, he made a brave decision. "I'm going to search for gold," he told Maria that night. "I can't let our family suffer for something I didn't do. I will find a way to move forward." With a knot in his stomach but firm determination, John said goodbye to his family and set off for the mountains. The journey was long and arduous, but the hope of finding gold kept him going. He arrived at a small mining camp where he found work as a laborer. The days were tough and the nights cold, but each shovel of dirt he moved brought him closer to his dream. Meanwhile, back in the city, the Thompsons struggled to adapt to their new life. Without the mansion and with their belongings reduced to the bare minimum, they moved to a small apartment in a modest neighborhood. Mrs. Thompson's arrogance quickly turned to bitterness, and tensions within the family increased. Mark, consumed by his addiction, became more aggressive and difficult to control. The fall of the Thompsons was a reminder that wealth does not always bring happiness or stability. Mrs. Thompson began to realize the errors of her ways, but pride prevented her from admitting them. Meanwhile, John continued to dig, coming ever closer to a discovery that would change his life forever. Months passed since John joined the mining camp. His hands, accustomed to handling gardening tools, were now hardened by the constant work in the mine. Each day from dawn to dusk, John dug tirelessly, driven by the hope of finding gold. The other miners, seeing his dedication, began to respect him and nicknamed him the fighter. Life in the camp was not easy. The conditions were precarious and provisions scarce. Despite everything, John never lost hope. He remembered his family with every stroke of the pickaxe and visualized the future he dreamed of for them. His fellow miners, many of them with similar stories of desperation, became a second family to him. One day, while excavating a promising vein, John felt his pickaxe strike something different. His heart raced. Carefully, he began to clear the dirt around the object and, to his astonishment, discovered a large nugget of gold, the biggest he had ever seen. The news spread quickly through the camp, and the miners celebrated the find as if it were their own. With the sale of the gold, John became a wealthy man. However, his humility and kindness remained intact. He knew that his fortune was not just for him, but to improve the lives of his family and those who had supported him. He decided to return home, but not before thanking his fellow miners for their friendship and unwavering support. Meanwhile, in the city, the Thompson situation continued to deteriorate. Mrs. Thompson, who had lived in a bubble of privilege, now faced the harsh reality of poverty. Mark, increasingly consumed by drugs, turned violent and began stealing to support his addiction. Mr. Thompson, overwhelmed by shame and helplessness, distanced himself from his wife. When John returned home, he was greeted with tears of joy and hugs from his family. Maria, Lucy, and Johnny could hardly believe what they were seeing. A strong and victorious John, laden with gifts and provisions. With his newfound wealth, John bought a modest but comfortable house and secured a bright future for his children. However, despite his success, the memory of the humiliation he had suffered remained in his mind. He decided it was time to teach those who had despised him a lesson. He planned a strategy to hire them in disguise, so they wouldn't recognize him, and put them in humiliating and hard jobs. He didn't do it out of revenge, but to teach them a valuable lesson about humility and respect. John spent several days carefully planning his next move. He didn't want revenge, but justice. He wanted the Thompsons to understand the pain of humiliation and learn the importance of humility and respect. With his new fortune, John acquired a property on the outskirts of the city, far from the bitter memories of his former employment. There, he built a majestic garden, larger and more beautiful than any he had ever tended. His first step was to create a new identity. He grew a beard, changed his style of dress, and adopted the name Mr. Williams, a serious-looking businessman with a deep voice. With his disguise complete, John returned to the city, where he knew he would find the Thompsons in their state of decay. Mrs. Thompson and Mr. Thompson, struggling to survive, had begun to look for modest jobs. Mrs. Thompson, who had never worked a day in her life, now faced the harsh reality of not finding employment. Mark, on the other hand, continued to sink into his addiction, complicating the family's situation even more. One morning, John, under the identity of Mr. Williams, presented himself at the market where Mrs. Thompson was trying to sell some personal items. "Ma'am, I've heard you're looking for work. I need employees to take care of my garden and do heavy labor. Are you interested?" John asked with a firm, authoritative voice. Desperate and with no other options, Mrs. Thompson accepted immediately. "Yes, sir. I'm willing to do anything," she replied with a trembling voice. John observed her with a mix of compassion and determination. "Good. Be at this address tomorrow at 8 a.m. sharp. I do not tolerate tardiness." The next step was to find Mark. John knew it wouldn't be difficult since his addiction led him to frequent well-known places. He found Mark in a bar, surrounded by other addicts and in a deplorable state. Without showing recognition, John offered him the same deal. "I need strong hands for work on my property. I'll pay you well if you work hard." Desperate for money to feed his addiction, Mark accepted without hesitation. The following day, Mrs. Thompson and Mark showed up at Mr. Williams' property. Disguised, John received them and assigned them hard and humiliating tasks. Mrs. Thompson, used to a life of luxury, found herself on her knees in the mud, pulling weeds, while Mark, with trembling hands, carried heavy sacks of dirt. As days passed, Mrs. Thompson began to reflect on her life and the decisions that had led her there. Mark, although resentful, started showing signs of remorse. John, watching from the shadows, saw how the lesson he wanted to impart was beginning to take effect. Every day, Mrs. Thompson and Mark faced new tasks on Mr. Williams' property. Mrs. Thompson, who used to order servants without even looking at them, now found herself washing floors and cleaning stables. The physical effort was exhausting, and the conditions were harsh. However, driven by necessity, Mrs. Thompson worked without complaint. Mark, on the other hand, constantly fought against withdrawal symptoms. His frustration often turned into anger, but the constant reminder that he needed the money for his addiction kept him working. John, disguised as Mr. Williams, watched from a distance, seeing how the weight of humiliation began to change their attitudes. One afternoon, as Mrs. Thompson was picking up fallen branches in the garden, John approached her. "Ma'am, it seems you're not used to this kind of work," he commented with a neutral tone. Mrs. Thompson, without lifting her gaze, responded with a tone of exhaustion and resignation. "I'm not, but I do what I have to do." John noticed a change in her. The arrogance had disappeared, replaced by a certain humility. "Sometimes life puts us in difficult situations so we can learn important lessons," John said, hoping to plant the seed of reflection in her mind. Meanwhile, Mark, forced to work in the stables, began talking to other workers, listening to their stories of struggle and overcoming. For the first time, he started seeing beyond his own misery and understanding the value of honest effort. One night, exhausted and dirty, he found himself thinking about John, the gardener they had unjustly accused. The guilt began to weigh on his conscience. Maria, worried about John's well-being, visited him regularly on his new property. Although she didn't know about her husband's plan, she supported him unconditionally. John, knowing that his goal was close, assured her that everything was fine. "Soon they will see the truth," he said, convinced that his lesson was working. As weeks passed, Mrs. Thompson and Mark began showing signs of change. Mrs. Thompson, seeing other workers and hearing their stories, began to value effort and dignity in humble work. Mark, for his part, started showing remorse for his past actions and sought ways to redeem himself. John, observing these changes, felt a mix of satisfaction and compassion. He knew it was time to take the next step. He decided that the Thompsons were ready for the final phase of their lesson, one that would lead them to directly confront their mistakes and seek true forgiveness and redemption. John felt it was time to elevate his plan to the next level. The Thompsons were beginning to show signs of remorse, but there was still a crucial piece missing: the direct confrontation with their past. He decided to organize a gathering at his property under the pretext of celebrating the success of the garden. He sent invitations to all his employees, including Mrs. Thompson and Mark. The invitation mentioned a banquet and a special ceremony to honor the most dedicated workers. Mrs. Thompson, surprised by the invitation, accepted gratefully, while Mark saw it as a reprieve from the hard tasks of daily life. On the day of the celebration, the property was adorned with lights and flowers, creating a magical atmosphere. John, still disguised as Mr. Williams, observed from a distance, ensuring everything was perfect. When all the guests were present, John took the floor. "Dear friends and workers," John began, "tonight we celebrate the effort and dedication of all of you. However, there is something more I want to share. In this life, appearances can be deceiving, and it is important to remember that the truth always comes to light." Mrs. Thompson and Mark, seated among the crowd, looked at each other with curiosity. "I want to tell you a story about a humble man who was unjustly accused and humiliated," John continued. "That man was a gardener who worked for a wealthy family and was accused of stealing something he hadn't taken." Surprise began to dawn on the faces of Mrs. Thompson and Mark. John, with a firm voice, continued. "That accusation was a lie to cover up the mistakes of another family member. Despite his suffering, this man never lost hope or the kindness in his heart." John paused, allowing his words to sink in among the guests. "That man is me," he finally said, removing his false beard and revealing his true identity. "I am John, the gardener you accused and humiliated." The silence in the room was deafening. Mrs. Thompson and Mark were stunned, unable to believe what they were seeing. John looked at them with compassion and determination. "I brought you here to understand the pain you caused and to learn that humility and humanity are more valuable than any wealth." Mrs. Thompson, with tears in her eyes, stood up and walked toward John. "I am so sorry, John," she said with a broken voice. Mark, following her lead, approached as well, unable to meet John's gaze. "I don't know what to say," he murmured, visibly affected. John, with a mix of satisfaction and compassion, hugged them. "Forgiveness is the first step toward redemption," he said softly. "From today on, we will work together to rebuild our lives with respect and dignity." After John's shocking revelation, the atmosphere on the property changed dramatically. Mrs. Thompson and Mark, still processing the truth, began to see John in a new light. The weight of their past actions was felt in every look, and both understood the depth of the suffering they had caused. The following days after the meeting were filled with reflection and remorse. Mrs. Thompson, in particular, began questioning every decision she had made. Her pride and arrogance had blinded her, and now, faced with reality, she couldn't help but feel ashamed. Mark, battling his internal demons, began attending support meetings for his addiction. The hard work and sincerity of the other attendees inspired him to change. John, observing these changes, decided to give them a new opportunity. Without revealing his intentions, he began assigning them tasks that were not only less humiliating but also allowed them to rediscover their skills and talents. Mrs. Thompson was put in charge of coordinating the garden's maintenance, using her eye for detail to benefit the natural beauty. Mark was assigned to create new cultivation areas, a task that allowed him to channel his energy. One afternoon, while Mrs. Thompson was working on a new section of the garden, John approached and offered her a glass of lemonade. "You're doing a good job," he said with a genuine smile. Mrs. Thompson, surprised by John's kindness, shyly smiled back. "Thank you, John. I'm learning a lot, and not just about gardening." John nodded, understanding the deeper meaning of her words. "Hard work and respect for others are valuable lessons," he said. "We all deserve a second chance to show who we really are." Meanwhile, Mark, sweaty but determined, was finishing planting a row of bushes. The physical activity and commitment to a meaningful task helped him stay focused and away from temptations. Each day, he felt stronger and more determined to change his life. The transformation of Mrs. Thompson and Mark did not go unnoticed by the other employees. Their change in attitude and dedication to the work earned them respect and admiration from everyone. Mr. Williams' property, now a place of beauty and harmony, became a symbol of redemption and second chances. One day, John gathered all the employees and, with a firm and hopeful voice, announced, "From now on, this property will be a refuge for those seeking redemption and building a better future. Everyone who works here will be treated with respect and dignity." Mrs. Thompson and Mark, standing among the crowd, felt a deep gratitude and commitment. They knew they still had a long way to go, but they also knew they were not alone. With John's support and the community they had created, they were ready to face any challenge and build a new life based on respect and humanity. As the days passed, John's property transformed into an oasis of hope and renewal. Mrs. Thompson and Mark, who initially accepted the jobs reluctantly, began finding satisfaction in their daily tasks. Mrs. Thompson, with her critical eye and sense of style, started designing new areas of the garden that not only beautified the place but also attracted visitors from the city. Mark found in gardening a kind of therapy. Every plant he cared for and every tree he pruned was another step toward his personal redemption. He started talking openly about his struggle with addiction and became a role model for other employees facing their own challenges. John, seeing Mark's progress, felt proud to have given him a second chance. One morning, as Mrs. Thompson and Mark worked together on a new section of the garden, John approached with an unexpected proposal. "I've been thinking," he said, "this garden has the potential to be more than just a refuge. We could open it to the public, creating a space where people can come to enjoy nature and learn about the value of honest work and redemption." Mrs. Thompson and Mark exchanged looks of surprise and enthusiasm. "It would be wonderful," Mrs. Thompson replied. "We could organize workshops, events, and community activities. It would be a way to give back to the community and teach others what we've learned." John nodded, satisfied with the response. "Exactly. I want you two to lead this project. I trust in your ability to make it a reality." Mrs. Thompson, moved by John's trust, accepted with gratitude. Mark, although nervous about the responsibility, also agreed. He knew this was a unique opportunity to prove his worth and contribute significantly. With the new project underway, life on John's property gained new purpose. Mrs. Thompson and Mark worked tirelessly, planning events and creating educational programs. The community responded enthusiastically, and soon the garden became a meeting point for people of all ages and backgrounds. The official opening of the garden to the public was a memorable event. Entire families came to enjoy the beauty of the place and participate in the activities organized by Mrs. Thompson and Mark. John, observing from a corner, felt deep satisfaction. His plan had worked better than he had imagined. As he walked among the visitors, he heard a woman comment, "It's incredible how this place exudes peace and hope. You can tell those who care for it do so with love and dedication." John smiled, knowing that Mrs. Thompson and Mark had found their way to redemption. That night, as the garden closed, Mrs. Thompson and Mark approached John. "Thank you for everything you've done for us," Mrs. Thompson said, tears in her eyes. "You've given us a new life and a chance to redeem ourselves." Mark nodded, sharing the sentiment of gratitude. John hugged them warmly. True redemption comes from the heart. You have shown that with effort and humility, it's possible to overcome any adversity. I'm proud of you. As the garden flourished and became a place of peace and community, the shadows of the past still haunted Mrs. Thompson and Mark. Although they had managed to redeem themselves through hard work and dedication, the memories of their past actions continued to haunt them, especially the lies they had told about John. One afternoon, while organizing a community event, an unknown man arrived at the garden. His severe expression and authoritative air caused immediate unease. Approaching Mrs. Thompson, he handed her a letter. "I'm a private investigator," he said, "and I've been following a case of stolen jewelry from several years ago." Mrs. Thompson felt the ground move beneath her feet. Mark, who was nearby, joined the conversation, concerned. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to stay calm. The investigator looked at them seriously. "The jewelry that was supposedly stolen years ago belonged to the Thompson family, correct? Investigations have led to new clues, and I need to talk to you about that incident." Mrs. Thompson and Mark exchanged nervous glances, knowing the truth was about to come out. "Yes, they belong to our family," Mrs. Thompson admitted with a trembling voice. "But it was a misunderstanding. We accused an innocent man, John, of stealing them, but it wasn't him." The investigator looked at them with compassion. "Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it can heal the wounds. You have shown you can change and learn from your mistakes. Let's move forward, building something positive from this." Mark, moved, promised, "I will do everything possible to be a better person, not just for myself, but for all those I've hurt." The shadow of the past had been confronted, and although the scars remained, the path to redemption and peace was clearer than ever. John's property continued to be a symbol of hope and second chances, where respect and humanity prevailed over past mistakes. The investigator nodded, taking notes. "I appreciate your honesty. Justice must follow its course, but considering John has decided not to press charges, this could be resolved differently." As the investigator walked away, Mrs. Thompson and Mark felt a mix of relief and guilt. They knew they still had much to do to make amends for their mistakes. That night, they met with John in the main house and told him everything about the investigator's visit and their confessions. John, with his characteristic calm, listened attentively. "I knew eventually you would have to face your past," he said gently. "The truth always finds its way." Mrs. Thompson, with tears in her eyes, said, "John, we've made many mistakes. We ask for your heartfelt forgiveness. There are no words to describe our shame and remorse." The tranquility of the garden was interrupted one morning by the arrival of an unexpected figure. Mrs. Carmichael, an old friend of the Thompsons, appeared at the property's entrance. Her face reflected a mix of curiosity and concern. Mrs. Thompson, seeing her, felt a pang of anxiety. Mrs. Carmichael had been a confidant during times of wealth and privilege. "Isabel, dear, how are you?" Mrs. Carmichael asked, extending her arms for a hug. Mrs. Thompson, though surprised, responded courteously. "Mrs. Carmichael, what a surprise to see you here. What brings you to visit?" Mrs. Thompson asked, Trying to stay calm, Mrs. Carmichael observed the garden with an expression of wonder. "I've heard rumors about this place and about you, Isabel. I decided to come and see for myself. This garden is beautiful, a true oasis. Is it true that you and Mark are working here?" Mrs. Thompson nodded. "Yes, we found a new purpose here. It has taught us much about hard work and humility." Mrs. Carmichael looked at her with a mix of surprise and admiration. "I never thought I'd see you in such a situation, but I must say I'm glad to see you well. I've heard so many things about the crisis and what happened with the jewelry." Mark, who had been listening from a distance, approached. "Mrs. Carmichael, we made many mistakes in the past, but we are trying to mend our ways and learn from our errors." Mrs. Carmichael nodded, understanding. "Life has curious ways of teaching us lessons. I'm glad to see you're finding your way. And what about John? Where is he?" Mrs. Thompson and Mark exchanged a glance before answering. "John is the one who made all this possible," said Mrs. Thompson. "He is the owner of this property and has given us a second chance." Mrs. Carmichael seemed surprised. "John, the gardener? How incredible. I never would have imagined you would end up working for him." At that moment, John appeared, greeting Mrs. Carmichael cordially. "Welcome to our garden, Mrs. Carmichael. It's a pleasure to have you here." Mrs. Carmichael, still surprised, smiled. "John, you've achieved something wonderful here, and hearing how you've helped Isabel and Mark is inspiring. You're a man of great heart." John humbly smiled. "Everyone deserves a second chance. Honest work and dedication can change lives. I'm happy to have been able to help." Mrs. Carmichael spent the rest of the day touring the garden, impressed by its beauty and the story of redemption it represented. At the end of the visit, she bid farewell to Mrs. Thompson and Mark with words of encouragement and hope. "What you're doing here is admirable. Keep moving forward and remember that there is always a chance for change and redemption." When Mrs. Carmichael left, Mrs. Thompson and Mark felt more determined. They knew the path to redemption was long, but with John's support and the community, they were on the right track. Mrs. Carmichael's visit had reinforced their determination to keep working hard and rebuild their lives with dignity and respect. As the garden prospered, new tensions began to arise. Although Mrs. Thompson and Mark had adapted to their new life, not all employees were pleased with their presence. Some workers who knew John's story and his unjust dismissal resented the Thompsons for having a second chance so easily. Anna, a longtime and highly respected employee on the property, began expressing her discontent. "I don't understand why John gives them so many opportunities after everything they did to him. They should be in jail, not here working as if nothing happened," she often said to other employees. Rumors and complaints began circulating, creating an atmosphere of distrust and resentment. John, aware of the tensions, decided to address the issue directly. He called a meeting with all the employees in the barn, a place he often used for community gatherings. "I understand that some of you have concerns about Isabel and Mark," John began with a firm but calm voice. "But I want to remind you that this place is based on redemption and second chances. We've all made mistakes, and we all deserve the opportunity to learn and grow." Anna, however, was not convinced. "John, with all due respect, they hurt you deeply. How can you trust that they have truly changed?" John looked at her with empathy. "Anna, everyone deserves a second chance. Isabel and Mark have shown a true commitment to change. I've observed them closely, and I know they are here to redeem themselves. Besides, this garden is a symbol of hope for all of us. We cannot build a better future if we are not willing to forgive and move forward." John's words resonated among the employees. Although not everyone was immediately convinced, they began to see things from John's perspective. Mrs. Thompson and Mark, learning about the meeting, decided they needed to do more to earn their co-workers' trust. Mark, in particular, took the initiative. He started working on community projects outside the garden, offering his help in building a playground and organizing activities for neighborhood children. His dedication and sincerity began to change perceptions. Mrs. Thompson decided to share her story with the other employees in an informal gathering. She spoke openly about her mistakes and her journey toward redemption. "I know many of you distrust us, and I understand. We made serious mistakes, and we are here to make amends. We don't ask you to forget, but to give us the opportunity to show that we have changed. Mrs. Thompson's words and Mark's actions began to ease the tensions. Gradually, the employees started accepting their presence and recognizing their genuine effort to make things right. John, observing these changes, felt relieved. He knew that redemption was not an easy path, but he was convinced that with effort and sincerity, everyone could find their place in the Garden of Hope. As Mark continued working hard on his community projects, he began to notice unusual and persistent fatigue. At first, he thought it was just the result of the physical labor he was not used to, but over time, the exhaustion became unbearable. He also started having constant headaches and intermittent fever that weakened him. One afternoon, while working on the playground, Mark suddenly collapsed. Alarmed, the other workers called an ambulance and rushed him to the hospital. Mrs. Thompson, learning of the incident, ran to the hospital with her heart in her throat, fearing the worst. At the hospital, the doctors ran a series of tests and soon came to a diagnosis. Mark had a severe infection that had gone unnoticed for too long. The combination of his past drug abuse and the recent physical effort had weakened his immune system, making him susceptible to illness. Mrs. Thompson, distressed, sat by Mark's bedside. "I'm so sorry, Mark. I shouldn't have let you work so hard without ensuring your health," she said, tears in her eyes. Mark, weak but conscious, tried to console her. "It's not your fault, Isabel. I wanted to do this. I wanted to prove I could change, that I could be better." John, learning of the news, also went to the hospital. Seeing Mark so fragile filled him with compassion. Although Mark had been a source of much pain in his life, John knew that true forgiveness and redemption meant supporting those who tried to change. "Mark," John said with a soft but firm voice, "we will make sure you get the treatment you need. Everyone deserves a second chance, and you have shown you are willing to work for yours." The following days were a challenge for everyone. Mrs. Thompson spent every free moment at the hospital by Mark's side, while John and the other employees ensured everything ran smoothly on the property. The community, learning of Mark's condition, also showed their support, organizing fundraisers and offering help in various ways. As Mark fought for his life, the relationship between Mrs. Thompson and John strengthened. Mrs. Thompson, seeing John's kindness and compassion, felt increasingly grateful for the second chance he had given them. "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done for us," she said one day, moved by his generosity. John, with a calm smile, replied, "True forgiveness is not only for the one who receives it, but also for the one who gives it. By helping you, I've also found peace." Mark's illness was a painful reminder of past mistakes, but it was also an opportunity for redemption and growth. Mrs. Thompson and Mark, despite the challenges, continued fighting, supported by John and the community. The hope and humanity that flourished in the garden became a beacon of light in the darkness. The days turned into weeks as Mark remained in the hospital, fighting his illness. Mrs. Thompson never left his side, and John visited regularly to ensure everything was in order and to offer his support. During this time, Mark had many opportunities to reflect on his life and the decisions that had led him to this point. One afternoon, while Mrs. Thompson was out of the room, John sat beside Mark's bed. "Mark," John began, "I know you've been through a lot, and I want you to know I'm here to help you, but you must also be willing to help yourself." Mark, with a weak voice, responded, "I know, John. I've made so many mistakes, but I want to change. I want to be someone my parents would be proud of." John nodded, seeing the sincerity in Mark's eyes. "The first step is to forgive yourself. Redemption is a long road, but you don't have to walk it alone." In the following days, Mark showed remarkable improvement. With proper treatment and the constant support of Mrs. Thompson and John, his health began to stabilize. This experience marked him deeply and motivated him to make a real change in his life. He decided to join a rehabilitation program for addiction, determined to overcome his demons once and for all. When Mark was finally discharged from the hospital, he returned to the garden with a new perspective. The employees who had followed his progress welcomed him with a mix of relief and hope. Grateful for the second chance, Mark addressed them with humility. "I want to thank you all for your support," he said. "I know it hasn't been easy accepting Isabel and me, but we are here to prove we can change. I promise to work harder than ever to earn your trust and respect." Mrs. Thompson, proud of her brother, also spoke. The experience of almost losing Mark has taught me the true value of life and forgiveness. We are here to work together and build a better future for everyone. John, seeing the determination in both of them, felt deep satisfaction. He knew the path would not be easy, but he also knew that Mrs. Thompson and Mark were on the right track. "This garden is a place of second chances," he said. "Here, we all work together to overcome our mistakes and build something beautiful." As time passed, Mark and Mrs. Thompson integrated further into the garden community. Mark, with his new sobriety and focus, became a pillar of support for other employees facing their own struggles. Mrs. Thompson, using her experience and skills, helped organize events and workshops that benefited the community. The transformation of Mrs. Thompson and Mark not only impacted their lives, but also those of everyone around them. John's garden became a beacon of hope, redemption, and the capacity of human beings to change and grow. One evening, as the sun set, Mrs. Thompson, Mark, and John gathered in the garden, observing the fruits of their hard work. "We've come a long way," John said with a smile, "and we still have much to do, but I'm proud of what we've accomplished together." Mrs. Thompson and Mark, moved, nodded. They knew that with John's support and the community, they could face any challenge and continue building a future based on respect, humility, and love. With the garden prospering and the community more united than ever, Mrs. Thompson and Mark continued demonstrating their commitment to redemption and hard work. One day, while Mrs. Thompson was overseeing the planting of new flowers, she received an unexpected call. It was from an old family friend, Helen, who had heard about her transformation and wanted to see her. Helen, a successful businesswoman, met with Mrs. Thompson in the garden. "I've heard so many good things about what you're doing here," Helen said with a smile. "I'm glad to see you found purpose and are helping others." Mrs. Thompson, grateful for Helen's words, replied, "Thank you, Helen. This place has given us a second chance, and we are doing our best to make the most of it." After a long conversation, Helen made a surprising offer. "I'm looking for someone with your experience to manage a new project in my company. I know you've been through a lot, but I believe your story and dedication can inspire others. Would you like to join my team?" Mrs. Thompson, surprised by the offer, felt a mix of emotions. "It's an incredible offer, Helen, but I'm not sure I'm ready to leave the garden. This place means so much to me and Mark." Helen nodded, understanding her doubts. "I understand. Take your time to think about it. I just wanted to offer you this opportunity because I believe in your leadership and potential to make a difference on a larger scale." That night, Mrs. Thompson shared the offer with John and Mark. "Helen offered me a job at her company. It's a great opportunity, but I'm not sure about leaving the garden," she said, visibly conflicted. John, always understanding, replied, "Isabel, this is an important decision. What you've done here is admirable, but I also understand you could have a greater impact elsewhere. Whatever you decide, we will support you." Mark, who had seen his sister's transformation, added, "Isabel, this is your chance to show your value and skills in a new environment. I know you can do it, and you can always come back to the garden when you need to." Mrs. Thompson spent the following days reflecting on the offer. The garden had been her refuge and place of redemption, but she also felt she had the ability to inspire others beyond its confines. Finally, she decided to accept Helen's offer on the condition that she could stay involved in the garden in some way. The news of her decision was received with support and affection from everyone in the garden. John organized a small celebration to bid her farewell and thank her for everything she had done. "Isabel, your dedication and work have been fundamental to the transformation of this place. We wish you all the success in your new path," John said during the celebration. Mrs. Thompson, emotional, replied, "Thank you all for your support. This garden will always be an important part of my life, and I promise to return and continue contributing in any way I can." On the day of her departure, Mrs. Thompson bid farewell to each of the employees, assuring them she would always carry with her the lessons and experiences of the garden. Mark, moved, hugged her and wished her the best. Mrs. Thompson left for her new adventure with a heart full of gratitude and hope, knowing the garden would always be there as a reminder of her journey of redemption and the importance of second chances. Mrs. Thompson began her new job with Helen full of nerves and excitement. The transition was not easy, but her experience in the garden had taught her the value of hard work and humility. She quickly adapted to her new environment, earning the respect of her colleagues with her dedication and work ethic. Although she was busy with her new responsibilities, Mrs. Thompson never forgot the garden. She regularly stayed in touch with John and Mark, ensuring everything was well and offering her help when she could. The garden remained a fundamental part of her life, a symbol of her redemption and personal growth. Mark, for his part, continued his path to recovery. With the constant support of John and the community, he remained committed to staying sober and being a better person. His progress was evident, and he had become an example for others in the community. One day, Mrs. Thompson decided to organize a surprise visit to the garden. Upon arrival, she was greeted with open arms and smiles by all the employees. The joy of seeing Mrs. Thompson again united everyone, and the celebration was emotional and full of gratitude. Seeing the progress and beauty of the garden, Mrs. Thompson felt deep satisfaction. She knew that despite the challenges, she had found her purpose and had managed to inspire others to do the same. The garden, with its beauty and serenity, remained a beacon of hope and redemption for everyone. As Mrs. Thompson continued with her new life and Mark kept working in the garden, John received an unexpected letter. It was from an anonymous donor expressing admiration for the work done in the garden and offering a generous donation to expand the project. The letter read, "I have seen the change and hope this place has brought to the community. I want to help it grow and reach more people." Intrigued but grateful, John shared the news with the employees. The donation would allow not only the improvement of facilities, but also the offering of more programs and workshops for the community. Everyone was excited about the possibilities this new opportunity brought. Mark, inspired by the donor's generosity, suggested using part of the funds to create a rehabilitation and support program for people with addictions, based on his own experience. "We could help many like me," he said with enthusiasm. John agreed, seeing this as an excellent way to expand the garden's mission. The mystery of the anonymous donor created an air of intrigue in the community. Who could be behind such a generous gesture? As speculation grew, the garden prepared for a new phase of growth and hope, always with the mission of offering second chances and transforming lives. With the generous donation, the garden began to expand rapidly. John and Mark worked hard to implement new areas dedicated to rehabilitation and community support. Modern facilities were built, and professionals were hired to run the new programs. The garden now had a counseling center, a meeting room for support groups, and workshops to teach practical skills to community members. The transformation was impressive, and the positive impact was felt quickly. People came seeking help and guidance, finding in the garden a safe and welcoming place. Mrs. Thompson, though busy with her job, visited the garden frequently to see the progress and offer her support. She was proud of what they had achieved and how the garden continued to be a beacon of hope for so many. In one of her visits, she met Anna, the employee who had previously expressed her doubts. "Mrs. Thompson, I must admit I was wrong," Anna said sincerely. "What you and Mark have done here is admirable. This place has changed many lives, including mine." Mrs. Thompson smiled, grateful for Anna's words. "Thank you, Anna. We all deserve a second chance, and I'm glad to see how this garden has united the community." The garden's expansion not only improved the infrastructure, but also strengthened the spirit of collaboration and support among everyone. John's vision of a place of second chances had been fully realized, and the community was more united than ever. One day, as John was going through the mail, he found another letter from the anonymous donor. This time, the letter revealed the benefactor's identity. It was Mrs. Carmichael, the old friend of the Thompsons who had visited the garden months earlier. In the letter, Mrs. Carmichael explained that she had been deeply impressed by the transformation of Mrs. Thompson and Mark and wanted to contribute to the garden's growth in their honor. John, surprised but moved, called a meeting to share the news. "It is thanks to Mrs. Carmichael that we have been able to expand and help more people," he said to the employees. "Her generosity and faith in our mission have made all this possible." Mrs. Thompson and Mark, upon hearing the news, felt deep gratitude. They decided to organize a special event to thank Mrs. Carmichael and recognize her support. The community came together in the planning, and the garden prepared to welcome its benefactor. On the day of the event, Mrs. Carmichael arrived at the garden and was greeted with applause and displays of affection. Mrs. Thompson and Mark presented her with a special thank you on behalf of everyone. "Mrs. Carmichael, your generosity has changed many lives," Mrs. Thompson said. "Thank you for believing in us and in our mission." Mrs. Carmichael, visibly moved, replied, "Seeing the impact of this place and how you have transformed your lives is the greatest reward. I'm proud of you and the work you have done." The revelation of the donor and the public recognition further solidified the spirit of community in the garden, showing that kindness and support can come from the most unexpected places. As the garden community continued to grow and thrive, one day John received an unexpected visit. It was Martin, an old colleague from the Thompsons' mansion who had heard about John's transformation and the garden. Martin, who had always treated John with respect and friendship, had fallen on hard times after the mansion was sold. "John, I've heard so many good things about this place," Martin said. "I'm looking for work and a place where I can find peace and purpose. Could you give me an opportunity here?" John, happy to see his old friend, hugged him. "Martin, there's always a place for you here. The garden is a place of second chances, and I'd love for you to be part of our community." Martin joined the garden team and quickly integrated, bringing his experience and skills. His arrival was a reminder of the importance of human connections and the power of friendship and loyalty. Mrs. Thompson and Mark welcomed Martin with open arms, grateful to have someone who understood their past and shared their vision of a better future. Together, they continued working to expand and improve the garden, making it an even more special and meaningful place for everyone who visited. Martin's arrival not only strengthened the team but also brought new ideas and perspectives, helping the garden evolve and adapt to the changing needs of the community. The garden became a true refuge for those seeking redemption and a new opportunity in life. Years passed, and John's garden became a beloved sanctuary in the community. People from all over came to see the beautiful space created with love and dedication and to participate in the life-changing rehabilitation and support programs. John, Mrs. Thompson, Mark, and all the employees worked together, keeping alive the spirit of redemption and second chances. The garden became a symbol of hope, a place where anyone could find a new direction and purpose. In a special ceremony, the community decided to honor John for his vision and leadership. During the event, John addressed the crowd with humility and gratitude. "This garden is a testament to the power of forgiveness and the ability to change that we all have," he said. "I couldn't have done any of this without the support and love of all of you." Mrs. Thompson and Mark, emotional, also spoke. "We are grateful for every opportunity and for everyone who has believed in us," Mrs. Thompson said. "This garden has changed our lives and taught us the true meaning of community and love." The garden continued to thrive, and its legacy was passed on to future generations. John, Mrs. Thompson, Mark, and Martin's story became an inspiration to everyone, showing that with faith, hard work, and support, anyone can overcome their mistakes and build a bright future. The garden, with its beauty and message of hope, remained a beacon of light for everyone who visited, always reminding them that respect and humanity are more valuable than any material wealth.